Former Citizenship Judge Gerald Pash, CFC Advisory Board Member Dr. Marie Delorme, Citizenship Awards recipients, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening and welcome to the 2021 CFC Inaugural Citizenship Awards ceremony. My name is Ghalib Abdullah, and I am one of the two co-founders of the Canadian Federation For Citizenship. As we wrap up 2021, let me share that this is supposed to be a momentous year for the province of British Columbia, as it marked its 150th anniversary since joining Confederation. However, it has been a year filled with substantial challenges during a global pandemic, which has also included extreme weather conditions, including the recent floods. It is during times of adversity that we also come across moments of shimmering hope, flashes of humanity, and instances of coordination and cooperation based on our shared values and common goals. This evening, we will showcase residents of British Columbia who have been demonstrating citizenship, have been at the front lines during this global crisis to carry out essential work to ensure our country's progress. To kick off this inaugural ceremony, let us welcome keynote speaker, former Citizenship Judge Gerald Pash from Victoria, BC. His address will be followed by the presentation of our recipients of the CFC Citizenship Awards, and we will conclude our event with a Citizenship Oath reaffirmation ceremony led by Marie Delorme. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Ghulamani Abdullah, directors and friends of the Federation of Canadian Citizenship. What a privilege and honor to be asked to address this inaugural Citizenship Awards ceremony. Thank you for the invitation and congratulations to those being honored. Let me first recognize that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations, located in and around Victoria, the capital city of British Columbia. Canada, of course, has been built on the combined contributions of our Aboriginal peoples and then those who came later from all over the world. For thousands of years, the person we now call citizen, as we understand it today, was nowhere in evidence. People banded together for mutual support in groups dominated by their strongest and most cunning members. There was little question of popular participation in decision-making or the rule of the majority. Anyone who disputed the ruler might be punished or even killed. Citizenship had to wait for the advent and maturity of civilization. Humans had to rise out of the darkness of a lifestyle in which force was the determinant of their affairs and the strong overlorded it over the weaker. The genius of democracy, from which citizenship grew, is that political strength resides in everyone who chooses to participate in it actively. And it was not until the 5th century BC that democracy began to appear in the new city-states of Greece. A succession of enlightened ex-rulers gradually handed over power to the people, but not to all people. Citizenship was nothing like the generalized status we in the Western democracies, and particularly Canada, enjoy today. For centuries, citizenship was restricted to male property owners. Women, immigrants, slaves, and conquered Indigenous people who formed the bulk of the population had no say in how the state would be run or by whom. And that is still the case in more than 50 dictatorships and autocracies that exist across the world today. Now, in the more than 150, but variable democracies around the world, citizens are rewarded with something intangible and priceless, some level of individual liberty. And liberty is fully appreciated only by those who are deprived of it. Canada ranks amongst the best democracies in the world. And citizenship has evolved differently from country to country. For instance, the British did not think of themselves as citizens, but as subjects of the monarch. On the other hand, the first mass revolt against authoritarianism in the Western world saw the American settlers overthrow the British colonial masters. The American Constitution declared all men were created equal, but said nothing about women or the mostly Black slaves. Likewise, the road to enlightened democracy in Canada has not been without considerable discriminatory pain for much of the population due to the attitudes and ideas affecting the British Empire loyalists, the authoritarian cliques of the French and English settlers, and the Aboriginal people. Much Canadian blood and tears would be shed before the distinctive citizenship that we cherish was achieved only 75 years ago this coming New Year's Day. Until January 1st, 1947, being Canadian was only a geographic adjective. Passport identification was as British subjects, born or living in Canada. Canada's experience in World War I extended the reach of civil rights in Canada. From a population of about 8 million, Canada and Newfoundland contributed a force of 650,000 to the November 11th, 1918 victory. They were mostly immigrants or the children of immigrants, but never again would Canadians think of themselves as colonials. The war brought some social change. Some women were accorded the vote in 1917. Yet racial discrimination remained a way of life. People of Asian origin were denied British subject status. Aboriginals would have no vote. It took another excruciating war to finally put the stamp of distinctiveness on Canadians' civil status. 80 years ago, Canada, with a population of not quite 11 million, contributed a fighting force of almost 1 million to the Allied victory. Then in the aftermath of the Second World War, Canadian Cabinet Minister Paul Martin Sr. was visiting the battlefield cemetery at Dieppe. The German defenders had properly buried their enemy dead using the information on the service tags. Moved by the grave markers that identified the soldiers of Canada as British subjects, Martin declared, "These men fought for and had died for Canada, and they deserved their own unique citizenship." Even though Canada had been running most of its own affairs since the Statute of Westminster was passed in 1931, Canadians did not have an official national citizenship. Martin introduced the first Canadian Citizenship Act to the House of Commons in the summer of 1946. It came into effect on the 1st of January, 1947. Millions of people living north of the 49th parallel became Canadians. Newfoundlanders were added in 1949, of course. And the act declared that married women would not lose their citizenship if their husbands became citizens of another country. But it would take further amendments to add Asians and Aboriginals who had to fight the democracy to serve for Canada during the war and to afterwards be recognized as citizens. Jenny asked that I answer some questions during this presentation, including telling a little about myself. I was born in Canada prior to 1947 and was therefore born a British subject, unlike millions of others became Canadian with the first Canadian Citizenship Act. My maternal grandparents came to Canada from Poland in 1913. Were given a quarter section of land. They built a homestead north of Winnipeg in Selkirk, Manitoba. Grandfather had a horse-driven saw and cut trees for lumber. My paternal grandparents came to Winnipeg from the United Kingdom. Grandfather, a cooper who made barrels in Wales, and grandmother, a seamstress in London. My mother had worked as a domestic and later as a waitress. Father was a laborer in a paint factory in Winnipeg when he enlisted in the Canadian Army at the beginning of the Second World War. He became ill in England and was returned to hospital in Canada. Discharged for medical reasons, he worked for Canada Bread for a short period. He sired me and died in Fort Osborne Military Hospital, November 1st, 1944, 19 weeks after I was born. Mother remarried in 1952 and we moved to Victoria as my stepfather was a member of the Royal Canadian Navy. They met when he was in Winnipeg for the Great Flood of 1950. I went to school from grade 3 in Victoria. As a child, I was a cub, a scout, a choir boy, an army cadet, and I gained much from the adult leadership of those groups. I can still see a straight line through my success from the influence these people had. After graduating high school, I went to work at a radio station to do the all-night show at 18 years of age. Then 10 years later, I was vice president, managing director of a radio broadcasting company with 5 locations, 50 employees, and in today's money, $1 million in revenue. I was surprised when I look back at it that I was only 28. I was just having fun and trying to figure it out. But what I miss most about radio is the ability to go on the air at 9 a.m. with some community need. A family needs to take their child to hospital at a distance, and by noon, you've got $5,000 donated to make it happen. It's kind of like fundraising online today, except it happens through the telephone, calling the radio station, and pledging money. And I did that several times. And the $5,000 pays for bus fare and some hotel for a week in hospital or whatever was required for this family to put it together to care for their child. I have a long record of community service. I was named Broadcaster Citizen of the Year by the British Columbia Association of Broadcasting, City of Penticton Citizen of the Year. I've been a member of the Rotary Club of 3 clubs for 53 years, Abbotsford, Penticton, and now Victoria. When we sold the broadcast enterprise, I had spent 27 years in radio. I was a member of the Canadian Forces Reserve, and an opportunity arose to do public affairs for the Royal Canadian Navy here in Victoria on a 9-month contract, an assignment that lasted 22 years from 1990 to 2012 as a public affairs advisor to the Commander of Canada's Navy in the Pacific. In 2010, I applied, and in 2012, I was appointed a citizenship judge and reappointed in 2015 and served 6 years. There's a large electronic footprint on the internet that I have no control over. Just search Gerald or Jerry Pash and you'll find out more than you ever wanted to know. What does it feel like to induct people into the Canadian family? Well, I consider my time as a citizenship judge the highlight of my service. The work was stimulating, purposeful, and rewarding. And while it was necessary to not approve several hundred applicants, I approved thousands more and presided to cause about 35 to 40,000 to become Canadian. On 2 occasions, I administered the Citizenship Oath for candidates in hospital who were not expected to live. One was a terminal cancer patient. The other was hospitalized in serious condition a day before scheduled to attend a ceremony. I was the first citizenship judge to regularly include an Aboriginal territory recognition in the ceremony script. Curiously, there was pushback from the local staff, but several months later, Ottawa called to explore what I was doing, and it is now a ceremonial fixture and perhaps a harbinger of the revised oath that you will recite today. When I began, there were 38 judges. When my term ended, only 2 remained as the work was changing with new legislation. There are presently 9 judges, 6 are in Ontario and Quebec. The current legislation actually has a sunset clause for citizenship judges ending in 2024. Since the mid-90s, the department has been depending more and more on volunteer guest presiders, defined as distinguished Canadians. For instance, they hold the Order of Canada or other national awards, including the Sovereign's Volunteer Medal. One aspect of my time as a citizenship judge was that I actually volunteered for 1 year for the privilege of being a citizenship judge, and that really wasn't the plan at the beginning. But because the department had closed the office in Victoria, I was told that if I were to accept the appointment, I would work from Surrey, located south of Vancouver on the BC mainland. Well, I looked at the numbers and thought, if the per diem amount being paid was less than and the appointment was still in Victoria, would I do it? And there's an easy answer to that, of course. But after 6 years of traveling back and forth, ferry, fuel, and hotel, I spent the equivalent of 1 year's compensation. And I'd do it again. It was wonderful service for Canada. I look at it that I volunteered to do all the ceremonies that I did, which was about 1/3 of the time. What is so precious about Canadian citizenship? I expect that many of you can provide a better answer than I. I was born here. I won the birth lottery. On November 11th, we marked Remembrance Day to commemorate those I spoke of earlier who defeated the tyranny that gripped the world in the first half of the last century. And one can only imagine if they had failed in their effort and history had turned out differently. Today, Canadians have life for the choosing because of the sacrifice of tens of thousands of men and women who fought to establish the condition that caused thousands around the world to want to share our democracy. Consider the good fortune we have had for the past 80 years: peace, order, and good government. 2 months ago, there was a national election. Millions went out and put their pencil mark on a piece of paper to choose who would govern. The electorate told those elected that we expected the chosen to do the work. There was no change in government particularly, but most importantly, there were no protests in the street. No shots were fired, and no one died. There are few countries in the world that can make such a claim after an election. Those conditions are not guaranteed. And there are many examples around the world where outcomes have triggered civic strife and costly mayhem. This is an amazing place to call home. I've witnessed the joy of Canadians in waiting when they cross the threshold and are declared Canadian citizens. I understand it intellectually, but as a Canadian at birth, it's impossible for me to share the deep emotion. But the experience of being part of the process was quite marvelous, and I am so grateful for so much that I learned. Generations and individuals are defined by the events and history of their life and time. The current generation is known as Generation Z. I expect they and the millennials will be defined in part by the unexpected impacts and the response to this pandemic, and of course, climate change with weather emergencies. In the same way that the greatest generation of Canadians is defined by 2 world wars, and most of us here are defined by almost 8 decades of relative peace, punctuated with economic fluctuations, international crisis, and technological progress. History has demonstrated time after time that engaged citizens will do the right thing to protect their family, friends, and neighbors by contributing time, talent, and treasure. What have we learned as a country from this pandemic? Mostly, we have seen that the concepts of service and duty are not old-fashioned. Their enduring value have protected this nation. Just as the early immigrants held barn raisings and other communal activities for their newly arrived neighbors, today individuals volunteer for search and rescue, they staff food banks, they coach youth sports, and so much more every day. And in an emergency, they show up to do whatever they can. We know that spirit exists in communities today, whether our neighbors are Canadian by birth or by choice. The pictures from the Fraser Valley flood are proof. We also learned that goodwill is fragile and it's easily disrupted. An example is found amongst those who would invoke personal freedom as justification for refusing to be vaccinated. The minority of the population who claim that is their right to refuse being vaccinated is correct in that choice. Where the argument fails is that no one has the freedom to act unlawfully against what is in the best interests of all of society. Right and freedom are not synonymous. You have the right to go through a red light, but you do not have the freedom to do so. Freedom to do so is restricted by the law established by the democratically elected governors of society and ultimately by traffic conditions. Likewise, citizens have the right to refuse to be vaccinated, but in the interest of public safety, those elected to govern have a duty to restrict attendance at locations and impose precautions to reduce the risk of the unvaccinated impacting others. A year ago, healthcare workers were lauded daily as saviors and heroes, and that recognition remains for the most part, but it has been tarnished by a minority who emphasize their misunderstanding of freedom in a democracy and without cause abrogated their duty of care. The peace, order, and good government promised in the Canadian Constitution and the Bill of Rights depends on the goodwill of every citizen to obey the law, take personal responsibility, and care for the community. Rights and freedoms do not come without responsibility. Simultaneously, the safety of civil society is maintained by each of us remaining calm and kind, with the aim to accommodate all points of view in the most appropriate way, even when we disagree. How can we be more welcoming and create a greater sense of belonging, focus on our common values and principles, and move Canada forward? Well, you who are being honored today are examples of the answer to this question. By being chosen for this recognition, you have demonstrated that you believe in moving Canada forward where every citizen feels they belong and are valued. That aspiration is only possible by knowing that we each have more in common than being different. There's only one race, the human race. We occupy the only planet in the universe that we know is able to sustain this life. We need to recognize that the minuscule difference in our DNA is not so significant as to label or treat our fellows as the other. Red, yellow, brown, black, or white, everyone is the same in the Creator's sight. One of the things that I often did as a citizenship judge that brought comfort to candidates was my point of view regarding accents. When evaluating a client for language capability, it was not unusual for the person to be concerned about their accent and apologize for how they sounded. My response was always, "You don't speak with an accent, I'm listening with my Canadian accent." And that is quite correct. We have an expectation that others are going to sound like us. How we speak is the result of what we have heard since birth and eventually gave voice to as we mimicked what we heard. Does listening with my Canadian accent cause me to pay more attention? Of course, because what I hear is my problem. The speaker's identity is no less legitimate than my own. The other person is listening with their accent, and I sound equally different. We listen with the only language we know. What accent are you listening with? Now, that simple notion speaks so much to the unfounded biases we might bring to our relationships. It is much more fun to celebrate the presence of our fellows, to listen and learn from the experiences, and through goodwill and generosity, lift people up to the life that we all desire. The rights and freedoms of Canadian citizenship were founded 800 years ago in the Magna Carta that limited the sovereign's powers. They're entrenched in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and the Constitution Act of 1982, documents that are recognized around the world. They come as the prize of Canadian citizenship, along with the passport. We all know that Canada is a remarkable country with precious rights and freedoms I've spoken of here. In return, what does Canada ask? Canada only asks that we obey the law, contribute as we're able to make a difference in our community. It's particularly important that we use our vote. We should accept jury duty if summoned, and of course, protect the nation's heritage and the environment. Each of us then defends Canada and our democracy every day by being responsible and informed citizens and knowing how Canada is engaged in the world, we contribute to protecting our democracy. In a moment, member of the Order of Canada, Dr. Marie Delorme, is going to invite us to join her to recite the Citizenship Oath and reaffirm our citizenship. The oath is not a one-way pledge. The sovereign in the coronation oath promised that Canada is to be governed according to Canadian law and custom. It is thereby guaranteed that the Canadian state, the Crown, will protect our rights and freedoms. The oath is the bond between ourselves and our fellow Canadians and those we choose to govern in the name of the Crown. Congratulations to those being honored. Thank you for your kind attention and the privilege you have provided me to join you at this special event.
Good evening. My name is Andrew Ng, and I'm one of the executive directors of the Canadian Federation for Citizenship. It gives me great pleasure to present to you the following award recipients from the province of British Columbia for the 2021 CFC Citizenship Awards. Our first recipient is Dr. Willow Thixon. A Cree, Anishinaabe, and Métis from Alberta, she moved to Vancouver 11 years ago to study at UBC. Already with an undergrad degree in kinesiology and a doctorate of medicine, she is currently completing a master's of health science. Meanwhile, Dr. Thixon is in a 2-year family medicine residency at Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. Her vision is to create a safe space for Indigenous patients in BC and break down barriers for access to care. Our second recipient is registered nurse Kim Carlson at Fraser Health Hospital. Ms. Carlson called for British Columbians to work together as a, quote, giant team to stop COVID-19 from overwhelming the healthcare system and devastating families. She spoke out against anti-mask protesters going unpenalized, calling them a slap in the face to frontline healthcare workers. She also articulated the fear that she and her colleagues had of contracting and spreading the virus while working to contain an outbreak at her hospital. Our third award recipient is Nurlap Sidhu, an educator from Eugene Reimer Middle School in Abbotsford. Her class project, called the Equity Backpack, was filled with artwork, journal entries, and other classwork centered around themes such as equity, equality, inclusion, respect, identity, and anti-racism. Having completed her master's degree in equity studies and education, and understanding that her students come from diverse backgrounds, Ms. Sidhu knew that lessons about equity and inclusion would be timely. On to our fourth recipient. It is an absolute pleasure to present to you Nikolai Junasov, a grade 7 student at General Gordon Elementary School. In his spare time, and especially during the pandemic, Nikolai has been 3D printing ear savers for firefighters, nurses, and other essential workers. Nikolai wanted first responders to be comfortable on the job, so he's been making these small plastic objects that are shaped like a headband with hooks on each end to grab the retaining strings on the masks, and they use them to hold the safety mask in place behind wearer's head without having to rely on their ears, keeping them more comfortable. And finally, our fifth award recipient is Tito Chang, owner of the Killarney Market. Staying stocked in the grocery store business has been more important during the pandemic than ever before, but Mr. Chang knows success and good service is more than just keeping shelves stocked and being at the cash register. It's also helping seniors who can't carry everything to their car and knowing who lives in his community. Mr. Chang's market happens to have everything to cater to that diversity in the neighborhood. You can find on the shelf Hispanic, European, Southeast Asian, and Canadian items all at once. Well, what an impressive, diverse group of recipients for the 2021 CFC Citizenship Awards, who are not only at the front lines of this pandemic, but are regarded as essential workers in Canada, and in this case, all based in British Columbia. We truly admire and recognize their important work during these challenging times. We'll continue with the next group of recipients, and I'll pass the floor on to CFC Executive Director Rahula Hussainzada. It's been an honor acknowledging the work of this group of award recipients. Thank you.
It is indeed a pleasure to be a part of the 2021 CFC Citizenship Award, as we appreciate and acknowledge the power of citizens who have been at the forefront since the beginning of this pandemic. I am Rahula Hussainzada, Executive Director at the Canadian Federation for Citizenship, and it is an honor to continue presenting the next group of award recipients from the province of British Columbia. The sixth recipient of the 2021 CFC Citizenship Award is Dr. Saira Sabzali, Clinical Director at the Dragonfly Wellness Centre based in Surrey, BC. Dr. Sabzali is a counselor, teacher, and storyteller who tackled money topics during the pandemic through therapy, education, and group support. From big life changes to grieving the loss of loved ones, and from job loss to personal growth and spiritual development, her work has been essential and critical. The 7th award recipient is Jahala Leonard, contributing reporter at Indigenous. Ms. Leonard shared important stories on pregnancy, birth, and systemic racism to highlight gaps in Indigenous reproductive healthcare access through the pandemic. Through storytelling and interviewing women with direct experiences, Ms. Leonard spread advice for other Indigenous mothers to remain alert and recognize added layers of barriers. Women were encouraged to raise their level of confidence and trust their own instincts. Let's now move on to the 8th recipient of the 2021 CFC Citizenship Awards. This recipient is considered an essential worker and has been at the front lines of this pandemic. Shane Curvion is a bus driver in Kelowna, BC. Mr. Curvion greets many of his passengers by name, and he approaches his job with a sense of duty and public service. During the pandemic, he has had days of fearfulness, confusion, and exhaustion. This Citizenship Award is to remind him and those like him that they are not forgotten. Our 9th recipient is Alex Watson, florist at Stong's Market in North Vancouver. During the pandemic, she took on a new role in crowd control at the grocery store. It was difficult keeping customers apart, but she did it with a smile. Ms. Watson recognized that a lot of people were really stressed, and she kept an upbeat, positive attitude. The customers appreciated the hard work of staff, such as Ms. Watson, who kept the store open and stocked for a community in self-isolation. Last but not least, it gives me great pleasure to conclude the presentation of the 2021 CFC Citizenship Award recipients. The 10th recipient is Rory Richards, who rallied others in her neighborhood to join her on a March 20th in a collective cheer of solidarity to show appreciation for those on the front lines of the pandemic. She did not give up. She messaged neighbors and used social media to spread the word until her idea became a nightly tradition and the movement grew across the province. On behalf of the Canadian Federation for Citizenship, I hope this evening has been inspiring as we have unveiled the spectacular actions of active citizens in British Columbia during a significant milestone, the 150th anniversary of when BC joined Confederation. Although the pandemic is not over, we hope that this evening's celebration will embolden you to stay involved in your community. No matter where you are across this nation, know that your actions, no matter how big or small, does make a difference. Our country's progress depends on you, and we need you. Thank you.
The Citizenship Oath was revised in June of 2021 when Bill C-8 received royal assent. The passage of Bill C-8 checks off one of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. The oath now refers to Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples in Canada. Indigenous rights are enshrined in Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. Indigenous peoples have been present in Canada since time immemorial. Canada's Citizenship Guide is being updated to make sure people understand the role Indigenous peoples play in Canada's past, present, and future. CFC looks forward to its release. And this is the new oath.
And we're good to go.
I swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Canada, her heirs and successors, and that I will faithfully observe the laws of Canada, including the Constitution, which recognizes and affirms the Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and fulfill my duties as a Canadian citizen.
What a remarkable evening. My name is Jenny Gulamani Abdullah, and I am one of the two co-founders of the Canadian Federation for Citizenship. A doctor, a journalist, a nurse, a counselor, a teacher, a student, a bus driver, a food market owner, a florist, and a grateful citizen. These are the spectacular recipients of the inaugural CFC Citizenship Awards ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, these are the phenomenal women and men that are battling the pandemic, keeping us going, leading with conviction, with hope and inspiration. They are the ones fighting for us, and they must never be forgotten. Even though we have ceased banging on those pots and pans, let us honor them. Let us pay homage to them, not just tonight, but beyond. Let us take the time to identify our frontline workers in every corner of this country, those who are carrying out essential work during this global crisis. Let us take the time to remember them and commend them. Although they serve with a sense of duty and work with integrity and commitment with absolutely no expectation for a commendation, let us continue to seek out opportunities to express our sincere gratitudes as citizens of Canada. After all, citizenship is a notable relationship that binds Canadians, all of us, all Canadians. This is homegrown leadership. Thank you.